Homesteaders, gardeners, and cooks. My name is Jennifer. Welcome to Miles Away Farm, or welcome back. Today in the kitchen, we are still deep in tomato season, and we are going to make a tomato paste. But this is a slightly different from a typical tomato paste recipe that you might find in something like the Ball Blue Book. And you can consider this rebel canning or not, you be the judge. But this recipe originates with Hank Shaw, who, if you've followed my channel at all, you know I'm a huge fan of. And Hank primarily focuses on foraged and hunted foods, and he has multiple cookbooks that are fantastic around that, all of which translate to domestic animals as well as wild-caught animals. But he also does a lot of really nice work around stuff that you can grow in your garden and condiments that you can make from scratch at home and things like that. So this recipe, he calls it estrattu or Conserva, which is basically based on Italian recipes for tomato paste. And traditionally what they would do, the rule was you never brought the tomatoes to a boil. And so you were always trying to keep everything under 200 degrees in order to preserve that fresh flavor of the tomatoes. I don't really worry about that so much. In Italy, what they would do is evaporate this down a little bit in an oven and then put it actually out in really hot rooftops in the sun in August and basically dehydrate it in the sun. And so it was a kind of like a traditional sun-dried tomato. That's definitely a pretty big lift for most people. Most people are not someplace where they have the right kind of heat that's hot enough and also at the right time of year. My tomatoes tend to come in September, and it's cooled off enough that it really wouldn't be plausible. I'll put the link to his recipe in the description if you decide you want to really go out on a limb and try that version. Be sure to cover your tomato paste with something when you're drying it. So cheesecloth or a piece of screen or something to keep insects and bugs out. But I'm going to do this. I'm starting it on the stove and then I'm going to finish it in the oven. This is not a short process. This is definitely something you do over the course of a 2 or 3 day weekend while you're cooking it down in the oven and you're messing with other stuff and you don't lose track of it. And honestly, once it gets down to a certain point, tomatoes are acidic enough and it's dried out enough that it's honestly, I think personally safe to just leave overnight in the oven with the oven off. I'm sure food police would disagree with me, which is part of why I say this is a bit of a rebel canning recipe. You can, again, if that's something that makes you wildly uncomfortable, just don't do that. Throw the paste into a refrigerator, completely cool it, and then heat it back up the next day would be the way to get around that. His original recipe calls for 20 pounds minimum of tomatoes, and he recommends using paste-style tomatoes. I did mostly paste tomatoes on this, but I threw in some heirlooms. Heirlooms are going to be more watery, so you're going to have more liquid. It's just going to take longer to dry out. But I had a mix of tomatoes that I was using up. I only had about, I think, 10 pounds of the paste tomatoes, and then I just threw in whatever heirloom tomatoes I had around. So mine was 15 pounds, and I ended up with a total of about 26 ounces of finished paste. So you're cooking this way, way, way down. You're evaporating it past the point of a typical tomato paste. Then it gets stored in my kitchen. It gets stored in the refrigerator with a little bit of olive oil on top. And I find that this stuff is basically bomb-proof. I always use a clean spoon when I'm scooping some of this out so that I'm not accidentally contaminating it with just random stuff from my kitchen. But I literally, the jar that I'm working on right now is from 2020, and I've seen 0 signs of mold in this jar. It's been refrigerated the entire time. So really long shelf stability on this, in my opinion. And I think that is because it is essentially dehydrated to the point where there's very little what's called water activity. And water activity is when you have water molecules that are basically free in the solution and are able to grab onto a mold spore and have that mold spore start growing, or some other thing that's in there. Basically, the bad guys that you don't want in your products are facilitated by moisture. And so if you have dehydrated something to the point where none of that water is actually available to those things, then it tends to be very shelf stable. This is also a lot of times why jams are fairly shelf stable, that and the pH. It's something that food scientists use when they're testing a product to make sure that it is going to be shelf stable. But yeah, so very low water activity. We're essentially dehydrating this. And it did occur to me as I was doing this particular batch, I've made this multiple times over the years, that I could probably do this in my Excalibur dehydrator and just work it down and dry it out in the dehydrator instead of in my oven. If your oven has a convection setting, use convection on this. It's definitely going to help it dry out faster. But again, this is a long, slow process. It does take quite a bit of time. The end result is absolutely fantastic and incredibly shelf stable in a refrigerated setting. I used to give this as gifts on occasion, and what I found was that the people that I was giving it to really didn't understand the amount of work that I had put into this, because it's kind of a 3-day process, and they were like, oh, thanks. And so I actually have stopped giving it as gifts, and now I just hoard it all for my own use, because if somebody doesn't understand the amount of labor that has gone into this product, I am not going to give it to them as a gift. But it is absolutely delicious, and I use it in place of canned tomato paste from the store, literally in all of my cooking. And if you've watched any of my videos where I've used tomato paste, you'll see me put a scoop of this in there. I don't worry too much about the fact that these tomatoes have boiled down at the beginning of the recipe in order to try to reduce some of the liquid out of it. But if you're really being a purist, don't do that and keep the temperature under 200 degrees the entire time. Personally, for me, it just wasn't worth it. If you dry this down enough, it should be like moldable clay. You literally can fold it over. I stopped before I got to the point where it was quite that dry, just because I only have so much patience and only so much time that I feel like I can realistically run my oven. And you have to start checking it a lot more frequently as it gets really, really dry. But I have made it in the past where I literally could just fold the product over like it was a soft clay. So you get this really quite dry. And then if you wanted to water bath can this, I think you probably could, and just follow the directions in any of your trusted, tested canning books. Leave the olive oil off the top and just can it for the time that it says for tomato paste. However, it is going to be a higher density than a typical tomato paste, although that's a bit of a moving target, because there's no way for you to know exactly what Ball or the National Center for Home Food Preservation means when they say mounds up on a spoon. Your version of that and mine could be quite different, and so the water level in those products is somewhat arbitrary anyway. But you could probably actually water bath can this if you wanted it to be shelf stable instead of just fridge stable. It makes such a small amount, and it's so concentrated when it's finished. I mean, I've got 26 ounces. That's probably going to last me 2 years. So I'm good, and it doesn't take up a whole lot of room in my fridge, and so that's how I treat it. Tomato paste, Conserva, strata, whatever you want to call it, however much you want to dry it out, it's absolutely a fabulous thing to do with 15 or 20 pounds of extra tomatoes that you might have this time of year. Let's get started. So here I've got my tomatoes have been cored. I don't bother peeling them or seeding them because they're going to go through a food mill. And I'm heating them up on the lowest heat on this back burner. And after about a half an hour, this is what I have. So my tomatoes aren't fully cooked, but they have simmered enough that all the skins are going to be loose and the pulp is going to be much easier to go through this food mill. So this is a Norpro food mill that I've probably had for probably close to 20 years. And it's a pretty decent product, and I only dig it out a couple of times a year, but we really find it does the job on things like that. And most importantly, it screens out all those tiny little seeds. It is a bit of a pain to clean, so I don't dig it out unless I'm doing a large batch like this. This tray that this is going into is called a hotel steam pan, and it probably holds a little over a gallon. It's a pretty good size. I picked it up at an estate sale, and it's very handy for projects like this. I do send my skins and seeds back through that food mill a second time because I find I get a much better yield if you press them one more time. You can see I did scorch the bottom just slightly when those tomatoes started to cook. It didn't add any kind of a burnt flavor to the liquid, and so I didn't worry about it. And then I'm bringing this to a boil and just simmering it on the stove for, I don't remember how long I did this, but probably for a couple of hours, trying to reduce that volume by at least a quarter before I start putting this in the oven, just because there were some heirlooms in there and it was pretty watery. So the liquid goes back into this cleaned hotel pan,
And obviously you can just fill up whatever roaster pans you've got. It doesn't have to be one of these. And then this goes into an oven at 200 degrees, and you're going to cook this all day. So you're basically just going to leave the oven on, do other things, set a timer if you're the kind of person like me who gets busy with other things and forgets that you have this in the oven. This is what it looks like after probably 8 hours or so. And you can see by the line on that pan, it's reduced by at least half at this point. So we're getting into the tomato paste stage. And then longer still, I'm now to the point where it will mound up on one side of this pan. And then longer still, I'm basically to a thick enough paste that I can mound it into a pile. And there was an overnight stint in here where I just left it with the oven off. You could probably start this late in the day and just leave it in your oven overnight too, as a way of reducing this. I think a crock pot would also work for this. I've used crock pots for things like apple butter and slowly cook this kind of stuff down. So here we are, one more stint in the oven. As you get to this point, you want to check it about every 15 minutes just so that you're not burning anything. One more stint. So this was the final drying, and it's almost to the point where I can fold it neatly. So past a typical tomato paste. And I decided this was long enough and I was going to just go ahead and jar it up. And I'm trying to spoon this in here one spoonful at a time without a lot of air bubbles. And so I'm spooning a little bit in and then giving it a good pound just to kind of knock air bubbles out before I add more. It's not going to hurt anything if you've got air bubbles in there, but it is so thick that it's pretty easy to get trapped bubbles. And so I'd like to avoid that if I can, just so I can get as much as possible into my jars. And again, I'm not going to can this. You could, but I'm not going to. If you are going to can it, follow the directions from a reputable source on Headspace and how long you need to process it for, which is a pretty long time because it's so dense. So usually 45 or 50 minutes on a tomato paste like this. And I wasn't sure what my finished volume was going to be. And so I just got a bunch of different jars out just so that I had them available. And I ended up with one 12-ounce jar, one 8-ounce jar, and then probably a half of an 8-ounce jar. I probably could have used a 4-ounce on this last one. So about 24 ounces, give or take, 24, 26 ounces. So there's our finished product, and I'm going to top this with some really nice olive oil. This is a good quality olive oil because inevitably I'm going to end up with some of it on the spoon as I scoop it out, so I want something that has a nice flavor. And I'm just covering the top so that the top doesn't dry out, although I find that it doesn't really dry out anyway. I'm not sure how critical this olive oil really is to this process. And this makes food police people lose their minds because you're basically creating an anaerobic environment. And so if there is anything that's gone wrong here, it's going to be an issue. But I think this is dry enough that basically nothing is going to grow. Wiping my rims just to wipe off any paste or olive oil that I may have gotten on the rims, and then putting a lid on, and then I'm just stashing this in the fridge. This is not getting processed. And there you have it, our finished Conserva for 2024. And again, this will probably last me a couple of years. There's our very finished pot that came clean quite easily. And then this is the jar I was telling you about from 2020 that got lost in the back of my fridge. And so this jar is literally 4 years old. And it's beautiful. I've had 0 mold issues, and it's still perfectly good. So there you have it, tribe. Homemade tomato paste, a great project when you're drowning in tomatoes at the end of the season. And if you make enough, this will last you several years. Give this recipe a try. Thanks for watching, tribe. If you like this kind of content, give me a thumbs up, subscribe, leave me a comment, and share. I have new content coming out every week.